Well, hello everyone. This is Tom Fox, Mike Huneke, and Brent Carlson. We're trying something new, which is we're recording a podcast and we're going to post it on our respective podcasts. And we're going to do that because it's a topic that I think is one of the most important that I've seen recently, and that is the issue of secondary tariffs. That phrase has been bandied about for a long time, but specifically since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The reason I wanted to do this podcast so quickly, guys, is I think this is actually the nuclear bomb of tariffs. Now, if you disagree, I'm happy to have you disagree with me and explain why it's not. But I was a labor lawyer a long, long time ago. And so a secondary boycott, which was not the union on strike against the company, but all those who did business with the unions, was the most powerful tool unions had. In fact, it was so powerful they outlawed it. So when I heard secondary tariffs, that's immediately where I went. So you're going to put tariffs on countries that are doing business with Russia. And if that happens, I just think all hell's going to break loose. Now, I may have, gone a little bit too far for the judicious lawyer and non-lawyer that you guys are, but that's how I feel right now. So maybe you should talk me out of it or say, yes, Tom, and here's our phone number. So how do you want to start?
Yeah, we'll try to walk you back from the ledge a bit, Tom.
Okay.
No, not a whole lot, Tom. I think you're right to jump on this topic. Tariffs are really important for a lot of reasons right now. Companies are facing some existential threats already. There's a lot of volatility, right? Companies and a lot of people aren't quite sure still where the tariffs are going to end up. This idea of secondary tariffs is really fascinating. It's a bit of a derivative from secondary sanctions, which are a well-established tool in the OFAC toolbox over at the Treasury Department, which were really designed for people, usually financial institutions were the ones in mind, but really anybody providing material support to people whom we have sanctioned as a means to make life harder for them. We saw the president make similar threats regarding Venezuela earlier in the year, but Venezuela's not Russia. By targeting Russia, we're wading into the conflict in Ukraine that the president has stated for a long time that he has a desire to end. It is a bit of a nuclear option for sure. Tariffs at even 50% are killer for most businesses, and certainly at 100% they would be as well. Brent and I were talking earlier, Tom, about what does this really mean and for whom? Obviously, we've seen statements from Russia already dismissive of the tariffs, but I know, Brent, you had some thoughts and observations about really who this might impact the most.
That's the real story here. Tom, I would agree with you. This is really the nuclear bomb of tariffs. If President Trump wants to get President Putin to the negotiating table, this is definitely going to get his attention. You made that good comment of who does business with this targeted entity. And in Russia, this has been a China story all along. China buys Russia's oil. China's been propping up the Russian economy and goods that are going into weapon systems that are being used by Russia and Ukraine. Iran is a China story as well. The biggest trading partners of these two countries is the People's Republic of China. So that's what's going to be the big impact out of here. It's the elephant in the room that's going to hopefully drive some motivation to get to the negotiating table to end the war in Ukraine. Quite honestly, here is where Vladimir Putin messed up. He had a chance when President Trump offered him to cut a deal, and now Putin is in a position where he overextended his hand. President Trump has all the cards on this one. That's where we are.
Pretend you're counseling any number of multinationals and you can pick the one you want. But how do you help them begin to think through this? Does that mean I need to look at my Indonesian contacts who may be trading with China? Does that mean any BRIC country, Brazil, Russia, Iran, need to be reconsidered? How do we begin to think through not the implications of this, but a response from the corporate perspective?
Well, Tom, I imagine many companies are already treating tariffs as a central compliance risk, both in terms of operations. How are we going to get the supplies, the raw inputs that we need in a cost-effective way? Do we need to reshore to somewhere else where those things are coming from? Recognizing that showing up the next day and declaring to the CBP folks a much reduced tariff may invite inquiry from them and may invite an investigation for them. If the secondary tariffs related to Russia are imposed, because Russia won't meet the president's expectations, and the president applies them broadly. This is massive. Your point, Tom, is right, absolutely right, about Indonesia, potentially the entire BRICS organization, potentially. And there's been a lot of press recently about U.S. efforts to potentially undermine that and its efforts to present some kind of viable option to the U.S. financial system, the more that many of those countries are the target of U.S. sanctions and export control measures. For me, Tom, what I would advise people is be very, very, very careful about things that are too good to be true, because they are. We've already seen multiple reports in the Financial Times, reports in the New York Times, of, in the context of China, Chinese suppliers telling American importers, don't worry, we have a way through this. It's frankly what I expect we'll see in future False Claims Act enforcement to be playing games with country of origin, playing games with where substantial transformation of an item takes place. A lot of things are going to be proposed in desperation, really, on both the importer and supplier side, that are too good to be true. Now, this is a very dynamic situation. What actually ends up happening likely will be different, but this puts a huge amount of pressure on suppliers of U.S. importers in those countries that might also be continuing to do business with Russia.
Brent, who do you think is going to pay the biggest penalty? And I don't mean an enforcement action from the Department of Justice, but is it going to be the U.S. importer? Is it going to be the foreign supply chain vendor, possibly Russia or China? Who is this really, not so much as who is it targeting, but who's going to bear the pain from this?
Well, I think at a certain level, everybody bears some pain, and it's going to be who is it going to hit hardest and fastest. This is where the president is targeting Russia and its main economic partners and trading partners that have been propping up its economy. That's where it's going to hit first. Now it comes to an issue where it's like, okay, if they think that they can stand up to that brunt of that pain, then good luck. But they're going to hit hard, and that's going to have a real impact on Russia's economy and supplies from China to sustain that. So that's the reality. Trade compliance issues are now catching up to geopolitical realities. There's another piece for companies to think about. We live in this world of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month. Yeah, that's true. It is definitely a world of uncertainty. But you can look at the bigger geopolitical trends out there, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the direction of where these things are going. You've got President Trump out there who's used this potential stick before as a threat. We mentioned with Venezuela. Now he's laying it on the table here with Russia. There are these geopolitical realities out there that are driving larger agendas. Even President Trump, he's shifted on this issue. His goal has been to end that conflict in Ukraine. That's been a driving goal. That has other implications geopolitically around the world for the United States and its position. Back to thinking ahead for companies, this is not the early mid-1990s and the halcyon days, post-Cold War. We are in a world that is fundamentally being reconfigured in terms of trade patterns. Open, globalized trade, that model is now done. Now you're going to have trade blocks, you'll have free trade agreements between certain countries, certain allies. It's going to be a very different world going forward from what we've had in the past. It's important for businesses to understand those assumptions, and the ones that do can plan and structure their business accordingly, and they're going to end up delivering value for the shareholders versus the ones who do not.
If I was involved in a different type of trade compliance, perhaps conflict minerals or something along those lines, I might look at my tier 1 supplier, but I would look at tier 2, 3, and 4. Is that what everyone is going to have to do now? Literally look as far down as either you can or some other standard to make sure that there's no origin in a country that's on the secondary tariff list because the responsibility is on the company? Or is it something else?
Well, Tom, it might be what some would call the $1,000,000 question. I call it are trade compliance officers going to be able to sleep at night question, right? Because you could easily see people not sleeping if they have to zero risk all these relationships. And you talk about some of these multinationals who have, 100,000 customers, they have as many or more suppliers and vendors, right? What's immediately going to happen if these come into play? Every supplier in a country that currently does business with Russia is going to create a subsidiary in a country that might not be perceived as immediately doing that, right? All of a sudden, all these companies are going to be presented with opportunities to buy indirectly through transshipment countries that maybe aren't on the short list of friends of Russia, but you're going to have to then really look at a tsunami of new suppliers and decide, oh my goodness, how and where am I going to draw these lines about where I rely on self-certifications by them about the country of origin, Or where do I need to do more? And whatever more is that, do I have to start interviewing people? Brent and I keep coming back to the idea in situations like this, Tom, that come up a lot in trade compliance of stepping back, looking at your own data, looking at trade flows over time, and can you defend changes over time, especially around key events? So every new supplier in this case that pops up if these tariffs are imposed, there should be an expectation that will be eventually challenged, especially because it will have a significant financial impact. If you are lucky enough that you have alternative sources in supply outside of countries that are very openly and very actively trading with Russia today, figuring out now how to move in that direction is going to be really important. It puts India in particular, I think, in a very difficult spot because India has had very positive press here in Washington, D.C. They are negotiating, I think, at a very advanced stage, the bilateral trade agreement that would include security, cooperation, and things like that. But they are also part of a trade bloc with Russia and Central Asia. They are also dealing with Russian oil very openly, benefiting, I think, tremendously from the price cap mechanisms that have been put into place. So whether these 100% tariffs would be applied to India if they continue to do business with Russia is an interesting question. Maybe this type of statement is exactly intended to influence Indian decision-making as they finalize an agreement with us and going forward.
Brent, are we running out of potential partners across the globe? Because India was designed to be the next country that the U.S. could have a multilateral relationship with to supply a variety of goods. I'm beginning to give up on Brazil because of another wrinkle of what's going on, whether India or not.
It's like all of us in these days. We have to make a decision. Countries are going to have to make a decision on where they're going to fall on this. At the end of the day, each country is going to have to decide which trading partners it's going to be able to get the most out of in terms of reciprocal value in its balance of trade. And what do they want to get? Where do they want to go? I understand the tensions going on with Brazil right now. We were talking about India. China is currently producing twice as many goods that its domestic market can consume. And it's doubling down on that. It's been doubling down on that strategy since its domestic real estate market started to tank. So this is almost an existential question for the Chinese economy. The problem is that these goods end up swamping other markets as well. At the end of the day, is Indonesia, is Brazil, is India going to sit there and just get swamped with these goods from the PRC while their own domestic industries face the same shocks that we've seen elsewhere around the world, including in the United States? I don't think so. If any political leaders think they can get away with it very long, I think they're going to be in for a rude awakening at some point in time. Short term, there's a lot of uncertainty, but if you take a longer term view and you look at the dynamics in play, it really sets parameters around the range of decisions that need to be made. There's a clear path. In a certain sense, there's a clear path for it. There's a lot of leeway in there in terms of how that's going to shake out. But for a lot of these countries, it's going to be the writings on the wall.
Mike, let me pick up on something you mentioned a little bit earlier in the podcast, and that was False Claims Act claims. I interviewed a False Claims Act plaintiff side lawyer yesterday, and I raised this specific question with her. She said, well, first, Tom, people have been doing tariff evasions since long before Trump. There's actually a history of False Claims Act claims in this arena. She said, having said that, of course we're looking for these, and we're actively looking for those. How do you counsel a company on that threat as opposed to all the other ones we've talked about? Or do you just say it's part and parcel of what we're talking about?
It's really what's going to drive the risk here. Customs and Border Protection have their own administrative penalties they can impose, but really that's not going to drive this. What's going to drive this are the multipliers under the False Claims Act and the incentives that whistleblowers have to bring those False Claims Act action. There's going to be tremendous incentives, not only for maybe disgruntled employees within companies, but also at disgruntled competitors who may say, we're playing by the rules. We're having to stand up new suppliers, either onshore in the U.S. or finding them in other countries, that whichever ones are left, Tom, to your question earlier, that haven't been subjected to tariffs, while the guy down the street is claiming things that aren't true and he's benefiting from that. So there'll be a lot of that. What's really interesting, Tom, is the element of knowledge. And this is a theme that the three of us have talked about before many times, and you and I have talked about many times before, and how a broad definition of knowledge really drives enforcement risk, and it requires a compliance mindset and a compliance playbook to match that enforcement risk. When you look at the False Claims Act, They don't use the word high probability like is in the FCPA and the Export Administration regulations. They say it's actual knowledge or deliberate ignorance or reckless disregard. Well, that's just a duck tom that walks and talks just like high probability. You have to be able to make within an objective process those subjective decisions in a repeatable and defensible way about where those knowledge thresholds might lie and where those red flags pop up. What are you doing about them? There will be allegations that people are aware of red flags, of too good to be true schemes, and they ignored it. It's not going to help people who want to try to push the line that you already have extensive reporting in major publications. I mentioned before, Financial Times, New York Times, that, well, guess who reads those? The government reads those as well. We've seen statements already from the current DOJ officials about prioritizing False Claims Act enforcement and specifically prioritizing False Claims Act cases related to tariff evasion. Look, if you're a prosecutor in the current Department of Justice, let's say maybe you had dreams a few years ago of being a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prosecutor. Well, that may not be as much of a priority even after the pause was lifted, but where can you make a name for yourself? Where can you get noticed? And also, frankly, recover lots of money for the U.S. government, just as you could in other enforcement areas in the past. It's by bringing False Claims Act cases to recover underpaid or non-paid customs duties.
Trade compliance more broadly, too.
So a company comes to you and say, how do we prepare for this eventuality? And I want you to assume you've already counseled them on trade compliance up to now, and now we've got to take this next step. What are 2 or 3 things you can suggest that a trade compliance professional or other compliance professional within an organization do to prepare for this risk? Well, Brent, I'm going to start with you.
Well, the first rule of self-defense is don't be there. There are current patterns of trade and manufacturing that, okay, it's not an overnight fix, but you gotta be moving now in that direction to reconfigure your supply chain in these new geopolitical realities. This issue is not going to go away with this particular instance that we're talking about right here. Whether or not these secondary tariffs get put on Russia or not, we're in a new geopolitical world. You've got to be planning your business around. And if you don't, the longer you wait, the bigger chance you're going to get blindsided in a very material way. That's really the first step. The second item would just be prioritize your supply chain according to what could be a target first. Earlier, the Bureau of Industry Security was issuing some common high priority items that were going into Russia that were supplying its war in Ukraine. Well, if you've maybe got some of those same suppliers in some of these targeted countries, you better start making that a super priority right now. Those are the 2 items that I would say to jump on.
It comes back to making sure you are correctly identifying not only compliance risk, but really enforcement risk. And that you are baking that into your risk assessment and how your compliance program is designed. It's not enough where you have those higher risks to just rely on self-certifications by other parties or by counterparties. Now, when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of customers or suppliers, whichever way the direction's going, you can't look at any meaningful percentage of that. But through sampling and through looking for outliers, by looking at your trade flows holistically and dynamically around key points in time, you can at least defend some sampling and testing that you might be able to build out based on those concepts. The idea is not that you have a perfect trade compliance program. The world is not zero risk. The idea is that when you miss something, do you at least have a good record that you're comfortable standing behind, or frankly, that you're comfortable your successor standing behind because you've been promoted or got a job somewhere else, that explains that you were aware of the risks, that you took a reasonable approach to identifying and assessing those risks, and that you allocated your very finite time and resources to mitigating your greatest risks. I think if you can do that in a way that is well documented and thoughtful, it may change over time. With the volatility that we see today, it may change every week, but that's the type of record you want to have. And you can tailor that to what you are actually able to achieve. This is not an exercise where anyone is going to be able to last very long in this type of environment, trying to, again, zero risk everything. We see a lot of turnover in the trade compliance space that is really avoidable, I think, if people are empowered to take more of a risk-based approach. And some of that comes from the government too. They've already been some signals in the enforcement actions and in guidance about risk-based approaches. I think that could be improved upon to allow trade compliance people at least a few hours of sleep at night.
Well, Dents, I'm not sure you talked me off the ledge, but you definitely gave me some things to think about. And I guess the other thing that you really brought home for me, Brent, was if your goal is to drive Putin to the negotiating table, there are no other goals. So some of the nuances we tried to inject into this, some of the other countries that I raised questions about, Trump may not care. And he said, this is my goal to end this war. And the only way I can end this war is to get Putin to the table, not Zelensky, because Zelensky says he'll go to the table. And I've got another deal with him. Maybe until we get some clarity around that situation, that's just the way things are going to be going forward. And we all have to prepare for it. So maybe that's it.
We're all facing a moment of truth in many ways.
Thank you for jumping on this pod so quickly. As I made clear when I started this podcast, I think we're near a very nuclear option on tariffs. And I just hope that companies prepare for what's coming.
You're most welcome, Tom. And for the record, we should just date and timestamp this, given how rapidly things are changing. Today is Tuesday, July 15th, at just about 6 p.m. U.S. Eastern as we're wrapping it up.
Thank you very much, Tom. Everyone be well.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.